all schools were denominational schools, okay? And all were publicly funded. And then Hughes becomes the Archbishop of New York, and he says, I have no problem with the Methodists and the Episcopalians all having their own schools paid for, but we have Catholics here now, and we're opening a school, and I want public funding. And they said, well, you can't get that. Well, why not? And he was from Ireland, but he understood American constitutional law very, very well. And he said, well, according to American constitutional principles, you don't have to fund any religious institution, but if you fund one, you have to fund all. And he said, so I demand funding for the Catholic school. And this school society had an emergency meeting and essentially said, you know, the old codger is right. So, all right, let's do this. They revamped their structure, and they made all of these Protestant schools what they called common schools. And the Catholic school was a sectarian school, and therefore unentitled to government assistance. And so Hughes went on his merry way and said, okay, well, we'll do it on our own. And they did. And then when he was starting to build St. Patrick's Cathedral, the so-called new cathedral uptown, Fifth Avenue, that was farmland. And he wasn't allowed to buy any property. And he had to use two laymen to buy the property and then give it to him.
Church has many ways.
And yeah, and, I mean, he was clever, or as you know, in the Odyssey, Pelutrapon, shrewd. But then as he was having the cathedral constructed, the Protestants threatened to burn it down. And he said, if a single brick is touched, I will unleash on the city 100,000 drunken Irishmen who will make this city look like Moscow after St. Petersburg, after Napoleon walked through. Nothing was touched. All right. Whereas the Bishop of Philadelphia at the time was, you know, mild and conciliatory into dialogue, and they burned convents and schools in Philadelphia. Nothing was ever touched in New York under Hughes. All right. Dagger John. So now we've got Bailey sometime afterward. The books in these schools abounded with the usual stereotyped falsehoods against the Catholic religion, and the most vexatious and open system of proselytism was carried on in them. The evil became finally so great that no alternative was left for Catholic parents, but either to prevent their children from attending the schools at all, or to cause an entire change to be made in the system. Under the advice and active leadership of the Bishop, Hughes, a systematic attempt was made to call the attention of the community and public authorities to the subject. And after a severe contest, it resulted in the establishment of the present common school system. The bishop delivered 2 lectures upon the subject in Carroll Hall, but one of the most triumphant defenses of the principle contended for by Catholics was made by him in a speech before the Common Council of New York, in which he replied to the arguments of Messrs. Ketchum and Sedgwick, who had been employed by the Public School Society as their counsel, and also to Dr. Bond, Dr. Spring, and others who had volunteered in his support. Experience has shown, however, that the new system, though administered with as much impartiality and fairness as could be expected under the circumstances, is one which, as excluding all religious instruction, is most fatal to the moral and religious principles of our children, and makes it evident that our only resource is to establish schools of our own, where some sound religious knowledge shall be imparted at the time with secular instruction. If we needed any evidence upon the matter, it would be found in the conduct and behavior of those of our children who are educated under the Christian brothers, when contrasted with those who are exposed to the pernicious influences of a public school. That could have been written today. I mean, exactly. You know, the French proverb, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. And then the final paragraph of the book. Though the Catholic Church in this country has increased much more largely by conversions than is generally supposed, yet for the most part, its rapid development has been owing to the emigration of Catholics from foreign countries. And if we desire to make this increase permanent and to keep the children in the faith of their fathers, we must above all things take measures to imbue the minds of the rising generation of Catholics with sound religious principles. This can only be done by giving them a good Catholic education. In our present position, The schoolhouse has become second in importance only to the house of God itself. Now, Hughes said the exact opposite. He said the schoolhouse more important than the church even. We have abundant cause for thankfulness to God on account of the many blessings which he has conferred on us. But we'll show ourselves unworthy of these blessings if we do not do all that is in our power to promote every good work by which they may be increased and confirmed to those who shall come after us. You want a mission statement? There it is, okay? Of course, the simplest mission statement for any Catholic school is that everyone here die and become a saint. Pretty simple, right? So that's the background. Hughes and company decided we're going to have a separate school system, and we've paid for it ever since. And in the 50s, we had a massive school system, and as Monsignor pointed out, it was possible for a pastor to threaten a local mayor with closing. If we did it today, since the public schools are half empty also, they would say, oh, bring them on, it would be great. But the large parish school that I went to in Newark, my mother was always sort of an activist. And she said to the pastor one time, Monsignor, I get tired of this. People used to call it, Catholics called it double taxation. I pay for the school system I don't use, and I have to pay for the school system I do use. And at the time, 70% of the children in the state of New Jersey were in Catholic schools. Not 70% of Catholic kids, 70% of all school children were in Catholic schools. And so my mother said to the pastor one day, Monsignor, why don't we just close all our schools for a week and push all these kids into the public school and see what happens? And the pastor's answer, oh, Mrs. Stravinskas, we wouldn't want people to think we're not good citizens. The weakness of that whole pre-conciliar era. We got to be, we're immigrants, but we like the puppy with the nose on the window, want to get through to the other side. So keep calm, shut up. He was the same man when Kennedy was running for office, and he gave that horrific speech to the Protestant ministers in Houston. And the next day in school, I saw him, and I said, Monsignor, now I was in 5th grade, okay? I said, Monsignor, what President Kennedy said, I mean, that's not right, is it? And he said, oh, don't worry, Peter. Let's just get him elected, right? And we got him. And, what kind of a Catholic president? A disgrace. And that whole assimilationism that was part of the Catholic ethos was there. So my doctoral dissertation at Fordham was on the Supreme Court in Catholic schools. And I had to fight like crazy to get the topic approved because the powers that be said, that's very inward looking. Maybe you should do something. And I said, well, if we don't start looking inward, we're not going to have anything to look outward from. All right. And they played all kinds of games with me for over a year, delaying the approval of the title of the dissertation. Finally got it through. But even at the last minute with the dissertation defense, problematic. At any rate, I analyzed all of the Supreme Court decisions from the first one dealing with parochial schools and government aid, which coincidentally was a case that came about in 1947 in New Jersey called the Everson bus case. A township outside of Trenton was busing Catholic school children to Cathedral High School in Trenton, about a 20-mile movement. And some bigots decided that we got to stop this. And so it went all through up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court judged the case correctly using the wrong logic, right? And they solved the case by saying what they called the child benefit theory, that this has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with the safety of children getting from point A to point B. And in the case, one judge wisely said, if a Catholic school goes on fire, the local fire department doesn't say we can't put out that fire. Similarly here, to get children safely from one place, from their homes to the school of their parents' choice. And that was a landmark case. And then there's relative silence on the issue until 1971, when a spate of cases begin for almost a decade, dealing with various aspects of aid to, if the judges use the word sectarian schools, the judgment was always negative. Sectarian is a nasty word, all right? I mean, you hear it a minute, you say, it's out there somehow, it's not part of the program. If they called them religious schools, and now the common expression is faith-based schools, you know you're going to get a fair hearing. When I produced this, this is a Reader's Digest version of the dissertation. But when I produced this, I was working for the Catholic League at the time, someone gave a grant to the Catholic League to give a copy of this book to every senator and congressman and to the justices on the Supreme Court. And Justice O'Connor was the only justice that wrote back. And she wrote to me and said, thank you, this may be very helpful going forward. And Justice Berger, who through most of his tenure was against any kind of aid to parochial school children, changed at one point, not because of my book, but because his grandchildren were going to a Catholic school. And he started to see things in a different light, all right? It's like people have very strong ideas about, divorce or gay marriage, and then one of their family members goes into it and says, well, it changes the chemistry. And so the things started to change, but all kinds of convoluted decisions. And since I'm in a generous mood today, and since all of you are so cheap, I'll give you a copy of the book. And if you have a conscience, it's $10, okay? So where are we now? Of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court, 6 are Catholic. Of the 9 justices, 7 went to Catholic schools, all right? The bad justice, who's Catholic, is Sotomayor, all right, who admits that she would be nothing without her Catholic school education. And yet, when her Catholic high school was in financial trouble and they went to her, she didn't give a penny, all right? Now, at least she doesn't pretend that she's Catholic, but she's in with the other 2 crazies on the Supreme Court. But it's fascinating, huh? 7 of 9 went to Catholic schools. Gorsuch is not Catholic, but he went to Catholic schools. And that's the quote conservative majority on the court that's been doing all the right stuff. Of course, those last three are all Trump appointments, and they've done a phenomenal job. The very week that they adjudicated the Dobbs case on abortion, they also released their opinion in the Carson case, which was precisely on government aid to parochial school children. And it's a case from the state of Maine, which was fascinating to me when I was watching it go through the levels of courts. Maine has a large number of districts that do not have a high school, and they pay nearby districts tuition for kids from their district to go to those schools. Some of them don't even have an elementary school. And so a bill was passed in Maine that to extend that any parent can decide to send his or her child to any school, and the parents would be reimbursed for the tuition cost. And once again, the bigotry surfaced. Now it's interesting, in those early cases in 1947 up through the 70s, Catholic schools, when you talked about, quote, private schools, it was Catholic schools you were talking about. But in the 70s and the 80s, the evangelicals got into the school business, all right? The Southern Baptist Convention defined dogmatically that the First Amendment forbids any kind of aid to government schools, to religious schools, until they got into the school business. And then I guess someone gave them a new revelation. They have development of doctrine also, and now that's not a problem anymore. All right. The Orthodox Jews, of course, have always been in the school business. Parenthesis, those schools have caused a tremendous problem in the New York metropolitan area because most of their yeshivas in New York are unbelievably substandard institutions, horrible education, sometimes not even any education in the English language, all right, either in Yiddish or Hebrew. And so last year, someone tried to get something through the city council that all private schools had to be evaluated by the city. Well, my gosh, it was the last thing we wanted to be involved with, huh? The government telling us what we can do in our schools. Somehow or other, it got finessed. But the report came out on the yeshivas that 90% of their children were grade levels below proper achievement in math and in language arts. So at any rate, the pool of faith-based schools today, we're still the predominant player, but you also have a large number of evangelicals involved. And then some people who have just started, non-religious alternatives to the government schools. That, by the way, is an expression I always use. I don't call them public schools. I call them government schools because that's what they are. The true public schools are the Catholic schools because they're controlled by the people, all right? If parents don't want something there, they really have the power to change it or to move out, and the place closes eventually, all right? So the Carson case comes out and says, if you do not fund all alternatives, you're engaging in religious discrimination. You're penalizing someone, all right? And, there's a famous saying coined by Father Virgil Bloom, the Jesuit founder of the Catholic League: a civil right penalized is a civil right suppressed. So we say, parents have the right to educate children in the most appropriate educational environment, comma, if they can afford it, all right? That's a civil right penalized. It was the same thing that was done in the South with the so-called poll tax, P-O-L-L, not P-O-L-E. And it said, yeah, everybody has a right to vote, comma, but it will cost you $5 if you want to vote, which was the way to keep blacks out of voting. They didn't have the $5 to pay the poll tax. So this Carson case is a landmark. And within a week of the Carson case, I believe it was the state of Arizona immediately passed a voucher plan and for $8,000 per kid. Now, let me make this point very clear, and I want the Floridians to weigh in on this. I do not ever want a penny of government money going into our schools. So what have I been talking about? I've been talking about money going to parents who then decide where they want that money to go. Why? He who pays the piper calls the tune. All you have to do is look north to Canada or look across the Atlantic to Ireland and see the absolute mess of Catholic education. Poor Cardinal Collins in Toronto, who recently retired, probably spent most of his episcopate fighting the so-called Catholic School Board in the city of Toronto, who were constantly pushing for abortion, birth control, gay agenda in the Catholic schools, over which the diocese has no authority, really. All right. And in Ireland, exactly the same thing. A priest from Maynooth called me last year. He's supposedly in charge of all religious education in the Catholic schools of Ireland. 80% of the schools in Ireland are run by the Catholic Church, all right? Very poorly run, okay? And very little Catholic identity. But he got a memo from the government education office saying that the course on prayer in the grammar schools had to include Muslim prayer and Buddhist prayer and Hindu prayer in a Catholic school. So that's why you keep all that at bay completely. Now, that's the practical reason why you don't want the money to come directly into the school. But there's a philosophical basis for it. Namely, parents are the primary educators of their children, and they have the right to choose the most appropriate educational environment for their children. It's interesting, that was also the logic used in the 1925 case, Pierce versus Society of Sisters. In the Pierce case, the state of Oregon tried to close down all the Catholic schools. And they said, this is for the common good. Everybody has to get the same education. What Mary Pat was saying yesterday about Dewey and, get them all together, assimilate. And the Holy Name Sisters, who of course are crazy today, but they were wonderful in 1925. They brought suit against the state of Oregon, not about religious freedom, but that their right to operate as a corporation were being infringed. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided with the nuns, a landmark case for parental freedom of choice. And the line is, the child is not the mere creature of the state. And that line, I believe, is the only line of a Supreme Court decision ever incorporated into a papal encyclical. And it's found in Pius XI's encyclical, Divini Elius Magistri, on Catholic education. So that's the philosophical basis for government aid to parents to make the decision. Now, in Florida, you have a program that money goes directly to the school, doesn't it?
The way the legislation is written now, it establishes educational savings accounts for families so that the money is delivered to the family.
Oh, it is.
Right. Not well, so they get their educational savings account. Let's say there's $9,000 in it. They have to spend those first dollars on tuition to the private school, and then those monies go to the school directly. So the parents never really see dollars as such.
Mhm.
They simply direct the dollars where they want. So if they have any money left over after they pay tuition, then they have some money to spend on other things. So if you want to buy a new computer for your children, then you can use the extra dollars that you have to do that. But they never actually see the dollars.
Yeah.
They have to then direct the dollars to whatever company is going to provide a computer or something. So,
and you say, well, the government can still interfere. Well, I view the voucher thing in this way. It's like food stamps, all right? You get your food stamps, you can choose any supermarket you want to use them at. And the government doesn't tell the supermarket, well, you have to have this kind of milk, or you have to have this kind of, seltzer water.
So there is a little bit of government intrusion in this new thing.
A little louder so they can.
Yes, there is a little bit of government intrusion, I suppose, in this new legislation here in Florida. One of the things that is a requirement that we have to do is we have to do an audit. And so when we receive these step-up dollars, there has to be a professional audit that is, quite a price tag to pull off this audit to demonstrate the fact that the dollars that we're receiving are actually going to the education and tuition of the students, and that they're not somehow being, siphoned off on other causes within the institution. So when you've got the church and you've got a school, the question is all the monies, are they all focused on the school, or is because it's a common account or maybe a common accounting system, is there any chance that some of those monies that are coming from the deferred state tax dollars, the corporate tax dollars, are they actually going towards supporting a church initiatives or parish initiatives? And so we have to do an audit that proves the fact that the monies that we're receiving goes directly to the education of the kids, the tuition of the kids. And so it's just a painstaking task to have to do this very expensive audit, and then to have all of the documentation to demonstrate all the receipts and all of the things that show that there has been no intermingling of funds between church and ministerial initiatives and the realities of education with the kids. So there is a little something there that has been an inconvenience as a result of this. We certainly love the dollars, but but there's an inconvenience.
Father John?
And a quick response to, like the company that does the audits for us is owned and operated by the former head of the Republican Party in Florida, who is a graduate of our schools, sent his children to our schools, and whose parents are parishioners at the cathedral. So, so it's I feel like I'm back in Chicago again, but
Well, that story reminds me, in the 40s and 50s, the mayor of Jersey City was, the Democratic machine, and as corrupt as could be, rivaling Chicago, and Mayor Haig, and and he had a park built in front of every Catholic school. It was a city park, and there was a fence, and there was a lock on it, and the sister principal is the only one who had the key before the lock. So, and that kind of, church-state cooperation works nicely,
One other point on this, I think, of interest is, the Florida program has been going for years, right? And there have been varying.
Now, Bush started that, right?
Yes, he did.
Bush,
Yeah.
right.
Yes.
Jeb, right. So there have been varying attempts to sort of infiltrate the program by the LGBT lobby,
Mhm.
right? So there's an organization called Equality Florida, which
Mhm.
has nothing to do with equality and not a lot to do with Florida. But anyway, they have tried to push the agenda into school choice and into the program. And I would say, the Catholic Conference and also the schools in general have been very effective in discovering those things and then counteracting them. So, for example, when I started in Venice, there's a program called the Hope Scholarship, right, which was a quote anti-bullying scholarship. And so if you said to the state that your child had been bullied, you could qualify for this scholarship, which is basically free tuition to any private school you want. And so the stipulation was that it would be bullying, which meant that you could say that your son or daughter was bullied because of their sexual orientation, no matter what the age, and they could get the scholarship. So the simple fix was just to simply say, we don't accept those scholarships. And so that's kind of that's helped to avoid that whole prospect inside the schools.
Back to the Carson case, the Supreme Court decision also made it clear that there could not be any conditions put on the religious school in order to benefit. So after the Carson decision, what happened? Some of the bigots in the Maine legislature went back directly and instituted legislation forbidding government aid or the scholarship program to any school that discriminated against sexual minorities. And so now the case is going back to the Supreme Court, who will have to say, you didn't read paragraph 42 or whatever of our original decision. You can't tell the faith-based school what it can and cannot teach, and what it can and cannot do. I guess it was Nevada, passed some legislation at the end of their legislative session last year, and then that was that contentious gubernatorial race there, and the bad one got the job. And the first thing she has done now is to try to reverse that legislation, to knock it out. It's not even been enacted yet. In Pennsylvania last week, Josh Shapiro, that horrible governor, who's also the one that produced that miserable, untrue painting of the church and the sex abuse business, for which the bishops of the state were supine, said nothing, and oh, we're so sorry. Yep. There was a priest accused in there of raping a woman when he was a seminarian. The only problem was that priest was a seminarian in Long Island, and he was actually about 12 years old when that episode occurred. All right. So he's accused in that. And then you have probably 25 to 30% of the accused have been dead for 30 and 40 years. And again, the bishops did almost nothing about it. And you say, if they had had a John Hughes or a Lancaster Spalding or somebody in the club, things would have been different. So anyway, Shapiro, as a Democrat, ran on school choice. I mean, this is very, very unusual, huh? And now the bill has gone through one of the houses in Pennsylvania. One house is a Republican majority. The other one is a minority, like the national, of one Democrat over the rest of the Republicans. He announced last week, though, if the legislation passes, he will veto it. He ran on the basis of school choice and now says he'll veto the legislation. So moving forward, what can and should we be doing? Number one, we have to form intelligent coalitions. All right. As I say, we're not the only players in the non-public school forum any longer. So in your area, are there evangelicals, or in the Midwest, Missouri Synod Lutherans, who I've been in the school business a long time, Jews, get the Jews involved. I mean, because they know the meaning of activism, right? And so it's got to be perceived as something more than Catholic, because the anti-Catholicism is as strong today as it was 100 years ago. Form intelligent coalitions, but educate your people. When I worked with the Catholic League, it was during the beginning of the first term of King Ronald the Good, and I would go around to parish school communities and work with parents to talk about these programs, potential programs. And in almost every instance, after my formal presentation for questions, a parent would raise his hand and say, Father, that's a nice idea, but there's a free public school system, and we've chosen not to use it, and we've been paying for 100 years. And I said, well, that's like a black saying, yeah, my grandfather and my father were slaves, and well, I'm black, and I guess I should be a slave too. What's the problem? But it was that Catholic inertia, all right? And so you've got to get above that. A few years ago, all of the Catholic conferences of the country were having their national meeting in Louisville, and they asked me to deliver the keynote address. And the title of the topic they gave me was "Motivating Priests to Motivate the Laity." And I said, well, first of all, motivating priests? You got to be kidding, all right? It's like turning a Mack truck around on a one-lane highway. But that's the first point, though, is people still, we can talk all we want about lay ministry and the lay people in the church, etc. Our people still are hierarchically directed in their instinct. We discovered in the Catholic League that if you wanted a program to go forward, you may want to have some lay people talk about it, but you have to have Father or the bishop get up and say, this is great, let's go forward with it. That's not bad. That's not bad. But it puts, a certain responsibility on us clergy to exercise leadership. I mean, what's a shepherd? That unbelievably stupid comment of Obama, leading from behind. Can you imagine? General Patton leading from behind. I did a retreat for some diocesan seminarians a couple of years ago, and the bishop came for one of the days, and he was the celebrant of the mass, and I was the homilist. And I commented about the role of the priest as prophet, meaning of other things, leadership, huh? And I said, yeah, that stupid comment of Obama. They tell me that the bishop was smiling all during the homily, thought it was great. And then when I said the stupid comment of Obama leading from behind, his face dropped, because that's what he'd been telling the priest for 2 years, that this is the way to be priest, leading from behind. And it was rather cool reception after mass. But that's the nice thing about being a kamikaze pilot like this. You come in, you say something, and you go. Or you're going to a parish and you say to the priest, what do you want me to talk about? All right. John Paul was interesting. The Italian said he was the first bishop of Rome they had since Peter. I mean, he visited, when he was in the city, every Sunday he went to a different parish and preached. But on Wednesdays, he would invite the pastor of the parish he was visiting to dinner with him. Tell me about your parish. Tell me what needs to be addressed. All right. What are there, 400 some parishes in Rome? And he visited about 375 of them. And the last year or two, of course, he couldn't go, but people came from the parish to him. All right. And so, I mean, it's leadership. All right. And we've been talking about, personnel as policy. If you're going to get any of these government aid programs through, you have to exercise the leadership. You have to surface the lay leadership. And there are parts where you really want a mother or a father to be the spokespersons. And there are times when you have to be the one. And that's a prudential judgment. What's going to work best in your community?